behind me.
Our guest today is a CPA. He started his practice in 2013, and his grumpiness has grown ever since. He's an active blogger. Several of his articles have been published in the National Post. Neal feels an obligation to speak out morally against these inherent flaws, unfairness, and needless complexities that define Canadian tax. His dream is for a Canadian tax system to be massively simplified to the point where his job as a tax accountant would no longer exist. His wife won't be too happy about this, but it is good for the nation. I love that. That is a great way to introduce you. It is Neal Winokur, and welcome to Libertarian World. How are you doing today, Neal?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You betcha. Well, and I think this is a very important conversation that we need to have in this country, because as we grow our budget and our deficit continues to grow, the tax burden falls heavily upon the people to meet that need. And I think there's much better ways to go about it. But the first question I really want to ask you is, what drives a man to advocate for his own unemployment?
That's what everyone asked me. What happened was, when I first started this job, 10 years ago, I didn't really know what I got myself into. I was very naive, and I was eager, and I was excited. And then you start to see how this whole system works, especially once I started my own practice, and you really dive into it. I really very quickly became very frustrated, not only with how much tax people are paying, which you really begin to see on a day-to-day basis. That's one issue, but really just the complexity and how difficult and stressful and complicated it is and expensive it is for people to comply with the tax system. And when I realized that this isn't like the top 1% of the richest people that are having complicated tax filings, it's every single individual in the country. It's not, the vast majority of my clients are normal people with low incomes, middle incomes, a handful are, in higher income brackets, but everyone has these extremely complicated tax returns where they have to hire me to help them. And I really began to realize, my whole job should not really be necessary. It shouldn't. And all the people who work at the CRA, a lot of those jobs shouldn't really be necessary. And people shouldn't have to spend hundreds of dollars a year to file their tax returns. And they shouldn't have to keep receipts for over 6 years and go through CRA audits. And I really started to see all of this in action every day. And I'm doing this all day long. And every night I would complain to my wife about this. And eventually she said, okay, stop complaining. And why don't you write some articles, write some blogs. I thought that was amazing advice. I listened to her and I started writing, and I realized there's a whole book here. This isn't just a few articles. And there's more than one book. I had to cut this book down.
Sure.
So I quickly realized, I didn't want to spend, the rest of my life just every year going through tax season, helping a few hundred people file their tax returns. Although I am helping those people, I wanted to do something meaningful to try and help millions of Canadians. 28 million Canadians have to file a tax return every year. And most of those people really shouldn't have to. And I realized if there's something I could do maybe to help all of those people, not just a few hundred people every year, I kind of felt like I have to do something about it, and I want to do something about it. So that's how this whole thing started.
Very good. And so I didn't read the book yet. It's definitely on my list, because I'm affected personally by this, as every Canadian who works is affected by this. These are issues that need to be taught in school early on. If this is the system we're going to have, should be empowered to understand what is happening. And I personally believe that it's written in a complicated manner, and it's done this way to keep the normal person from understanding how they're getting fleeced. And it's top to bottom. So in your summary early on in the book, it talks about how there's other countries who have reformed their taxes, countries like New Zealand and you know, in the UK, 90% of the people don't have to file tax system or returns.
Yeah.
What can we do in Canada to emulate these models, or what would improve our system to make that a lot easier?
Right. So the main thing is employees. We have to look at two categories separately: employees and self-employed. So for employees, which is the majority, it's very simple. What's so frustrating is that this is so simple and so easy to do. It makes me so, it gets me so worked up and upset that they haven't done this already. So employees already get a T4 slip, right? Every employee gets their T4 at the end of the year. And then they take their T4 and they have to input that information into some sort of tax software and file it to CRA. If someone makes a mistake inputting the information from their T4, the CRA will correct it automatically because they already have the T4. The employer files the T4 to CRA. And when you get your T4, the CRA also gets it. So why do we have to send it to them? It's crazy. And the reason why we have to send it to them is because there's deductions and credits. So there's like over 100 tax deductions and tax credits that make our tax system so complicated. And that's the frustrating part. People are afraid to file their own tax returns because they don't want to miss anything. They feel like, oh, I might miss a credit or deduction here. And the people that do file their own tax returns, they have to spend a lot of time. Either they have very simple returns, or they spend a lot of time making sure they're not missing anything. So all we have to do, it's so simple, is you eliminate every single tax deduction and credit and lower the tax rate to make up the difference. So in theory, it could be a revenue neutral plan. And then my dream would be that the T4 is the tax return. That's it. And some of these other countries, that's what they do. So in England, in the UK, employees don't have to file a tax return. The employer takes the T4, or whatever they call it there, files it to the government, and that's it. I mean, for the majority of people, unless you have capital gains to report, or if you're self-employed. So that would solve the problem for literally millions of Canadians who would no longer have to file a tax return, no longer have to keep receipts, no longer have to spend hundreds of dollars a year hiring accountants. I mean, it's crazy. So it's actually a pretty simple solution for employees.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that's like advocating a flat tax or a very simple tiered tax to a certain income, and lowering the amount that you pay at a percentage, but also maybe raising that minimum that you would pay into, right? I've often said that the best way, if you want to help poverty out in this country, is to raise the minimum you're allowed to make before you pay taxes to $30,000.
Right.
It puts the money straight into the hands of those people at the bottom end.
Yeah.
And those at the top, if you're paying a flat tax, are going to pay the percentage. You take away all of the, the fluff and those boutique tax credits that businesses especially and upper income people get. That aren't there for the smaller guy. And if you got rid of that, that's going to hold their feet to the fire. They're going to pay their amount, and it simplifies everything. So I 100% agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And why we haven't done it in this country, I would imagine, again, is because if you keep it complicated, you allow those credits to slide by for a vast majority of people, right? They're not filing, they're not getting every dollar that they could get back. It's kind of like, we're going to take this pile of money and hope you don't ask for any of it back, even though we've offered it to you in code, right? So
I think
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think politicians love tax credits and deductions because they can target their favorite group of voters. And every political party is guilty of this. So the Harper conservatives did this with their child fitness credit, child arts tax credit, public transit tax credit, home renovation tax credit. They lowered people's tax bills, which I liked, but they did it in a very complicated way. The Liberals came in 2015, 2016. They got rid of all those tax credits and they put in their own. So they put in a tax credit for teachers to claim school supplies, because, the Liberals and the teachers. And then they put in the climate action incentive, which is another tax credit. So every political party does this. They love these credits and deductions. because it helps them politically. And it
Yes.
sounds great during an election campaign. It sounds great. We're helping families with children with the child fitness credit, but it just makes the system so much more complicated.
Of course, and then again, as it switches left to right, those
Right.
credits change, and
They
you
keep
can't
changing.
stay. Yeah, you can't stay on it because what was good in 2015 is no longer good in 2020, and
Exactly.
and it keeps it convoluted and very difficult. It's funny you say that because I was on the debate stage in 2019 in the election federally, and
Yeah.
the conservative MP, or the guy who won the election in my riding, he was saying, well, if we get elected, we're gonna help lower income families because we're gonna do this specific tax credit. And it was
Yeah.
really isolated what he was saying.
Right.
And my answer to that was, that does nothing for the common person. What you
Right.
really want to do is raise that minimum up, make a flat tax for that person, and it solves all the problems.
Yeah.
But that doesn't appeal to these parties because it no longer isolates their voters. It's not picking a winner or a loser, which is ultimately what government loves to do. Is they love to pick
Right.
winners and losers.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we would love to get away from that. I as libertarians. So I just want to
Yeah.
clarify that when you say all the parties, I want to say all the parties except for us libertarians who understand what
Right.
freedom is and
Yeah.
and that, because that's a huge issue.
Yeah.
As I was reading through your chapters, there's 2 chapters in the book that personally affect me.
Mhm.
And I want to tell you my story a little bit, and then I want you to maybe respond to that and see what you think about that.
Sure.
But chapter 8 and chapter 9 talk about how the government can just kind of come in and, well, we've reassessed you and now you owe this amount of money. And not only do you owe that amount of money, because we've determined that you filed incorrectly, we're going to penalize you. We're going to charge penalties and interest going back to the original date.
Yeah.
So in 2009, when I split up with my baby mama, we decided to dissolve everything.
Mm-hmm.
So we both declared bankruptcy and we put everything out on the table. I never wanted to do that. I didn't want to proceed with that. But in the moment of duress and anguish that I was going through, I agreed with whatever she said. I never made one payment on that bankruptcy because at the end of the day, all I ever owed was CRA.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is the minute I filed that bankruptcy, CRA reassessed all of my taxes. And they said, you owe $26,000. I've tried to get out from in behind the bankruptcy and just say, I want to pay the $26,000 because that's all I owe. And let's do that. Well, they sent me a letter in 2012 saying, not only is it $26,000 that you owe, but you owe penalties and interest because of the reassessment. You now owe $54,000.
Wow.
So since 2012, I've been paying back a $54,000 debt that was supposed to be $26,000.
Yeah.
I've probably paid $62,000 back now, and I think I'm down to the last $1,200 or $1,500. What I have done now recently, though, is I've applied for relief on interest and penalties.
Right.
I'm not sure that I will be able to get the original penalties and interest because it is back to 2009, and I kind of just missed that window.
Mm-hmm.
But there should be some relief given to me somewhere in there over the next 10 years of interest that they charged on all of that. Yeah. What is your thought on that? And how would you advise a client that had something like that happen to them?
Yeah. I mean, the penalties and interest, the way they calculate it, if you file a tax return late, the penalty is 5% of the amount of tax owing. So already right there, I don't like that, because let's say someone in 1 year has a huge amount of income. They sold a condo or something that was a rental property, and they have a big capital gain and they have a big amount of tax owing, and they file a return a few days late, they forgot, or a month late or something. Then they're slapped with a 5% penalty of the amount owing. It's not a flat amount. And then, so already right there, I can't stand that. The penalties and interest are applied by an automated system. There's not someone there that's manually, I'm going to apply. It's just it's a robot. It's AI. It's just an automated system. And if you want to request relief, then you have to deal with the taxpayer relief department. And the way they work is they have to follow the guidelines that are handed to them from the ministry, from above. They can't really, there's no forgiveness for making honest mistakes. And that's what really bothers me because, and it's like you said before, the tax system is so complicated that honest mistakes are a normal part of it. But penalties and interest apply to honest mistakes. And if you file a taxpayer relief request to relieve penalties and interest that were applied in a case where it was an honest mistake, that's not an excuse. They say ignorance of the law is not an excuse. You have to know this piece of legislation. The Income Tax Act is 3,000 pages long. So, and I write about this in my book, that when income tax first started in Canada, it was in 1917, to be temporary to fund World War I, and it was supposed to be over once the war was over. It's over 100 years later, we still have it. But when income tax first started, the legislation was only 11 pages long. You could read the Income Tax Act back then in 20 minutes and understand it, and it only applied tax to the top 2% of income earners. So, and only they had to file a tax return. The bottom 98% of people didn't even have to file a tax return. Today, I mean, even if you have income, but you want to see your GST credits or whether Canada Child Benefits, you have to file a tax return. Everyone has to file, pretty much. And and like you said, the income tax starts at, it's approximately now 13,000 of income. The basic exemption is only 13,000, which is really low, and it's applying to everyone. So the penalties and interest regime, it's so hard not to make a mistake that it's become too onerous. And what I say in my book is there should be a 30-day grace period. No penalties should apply for a tax return that's filed within the first 30 days after the deadline. And then after that, the penalties should have to be applied by a human being that calls you first. This is my idea. They have to call you and ask, okay, like, was there a good reason you filed late? Like, did you have a death in the family? Is there an illness? Did you just forget because you were really busy? Okay, we'll waive the penalty. So there's ways that we can make the system like much more humane, right? Because we already have such a big tax burden. The taxes itself are already so high. They don't need to go crazy with these penalties and interest to scare people. So there's a lot we could do to simplify it. But people's specific situations, this is what I advise in the book. Everyone just has to file on time every year, stay on top of it, set reminders in your Google Calendar or whatever calendar you use so you don't forget to file on time every year. And people can run into some crazy tax nightmares if it happens all the time. Every year I usually get one or two people come to me and they say, I haven't filed tax returns for 10 years. What do I do? And the CRA does these arbitrary assessments where they basically make up a tax return with whatever T-slips you might already have on your file and anything else, and you're missing out. You have to file the real tax return to get whatever deductions and credits you're entitled to. So it's really just a crazy system, and that's why I really hope for, and I call for in the book, we have to move to a system, what they call a no filing system. So the correct amount of tax is deducted from every paycheck, and then the T4 is the tax return, and that's it. The basic exemption, like you were saying before, it should be maybe $30,000. What I actually calculated was if we abolished every tax credit and deduction, we could raise the basic exemption to about 50,000, about 49,000. This is for the federal brackets. Like every province would have to do the same analysis. Sure. And then the next federal tax bracket, which goes up to about 97,000 of income, we could cut that rate in half from 20% federal rate to 10%. And everyone would benefit from that first 50,000 being taxed at zero income. And you can even add in, for people on the political left or even some libertarians like this, you could have a sort of negative income tax or guaranteed minimum income system where we're already spending that money right now, GST credits, old age security, guaranteed income supplement, Canada Child Benefits. Those four credits I just mentioned add up to $80 billion a year just federally that we could kind of retarget to those on the lowest end. So there's a lot we could do to fix it. And I talk about this in the book. But specifically penalties and interest, it absolutely needs to be more humane. And they have to allow relief of penalties and interest when people make honest mistakes. Because that's the biggest thing right now, that it's impossible. And even accountants make mistakes. Sure. One of my favorite stories is someone told me once that it was a high net worth person, and they went to one of the top tax people in the country, one of the top guys in the country, for some complicated tax advice. And this top guy in the country, one of these guys, didn't know the rule that you could actually have a principal residence outside of Canada. So some people owned a second home in Florida or whatever. You can declare that as a principal residence if you live there for part of the year. And this guy thought, are you sure principal residence has to be inside Canada? And it's not true. And it's right on the CRA website. You could find it, that you can have a principal residence outside of Canada. And even I didn't know that. And the top tax guy in the country doesn't know that. No one knows the rules. The people at the CRA don't know the rules. Normal human beings don't know the rules. The politicians don't know the rules. I remember there was an MP federally that didn't know how the tax brackets worked. And he's a member of parliament, and even he doesn't know how it works. So, and that's the problem with penalties and interest. People get caught up, and it's the frustration
It's the F5 tornado of government coming in. It will kick over a trailer and it'll leave the rest of the trailer park alone. But that one trailer that gets hit is completely demolished. And I believe that that's what the interest and penalties program is. It has no feeling. It has no emotion. It has no judgment.
Right.
It just, a blip comes up on the computer and bam, there goes your trailer.
Yeah. Look, the Taxpayer Relief Department, I've dealt with them over the phone, and to their credit, some of the people who work there, they want to help and they care and they want to relieve the penalties and interest in a lot of cases, but they're stuck. It's not their fault. And I say this in the book. It's not the fault of the people at CRA. It's the Ministry of Finance that's responsible for the legislation. So I blame the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, pretty much every one of the past 50 years that has allowed this complexity to increase every single time there's a new government. So the Taxpayer Relief Department, like, they want to help usually, but their hands are tied. They have to follow the rules. There's very strict guidelines they have when they can relieve the penalties and interest.
I wonder what type of alcoholism is in that department, because imagine wanting to help and every single person that calls in has tears in their eyes and their life is demolished and there's nothing you can do because you're handcuffed to help them. I can't imagine wanting to do that for a living, and I don't think I would last very long at it, because I would be a grumpy CRA agent
exactly.
At that point, right?
There could be a whole book about that. Exactly.
Sure. And so you were dead on when you say, this is a temporary tax, and you see the quote floating around that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government, legislation, right? Yeah. So, and we're going to see that now with all of this COVID stuff. But I wanted to kind of keep the conversation on taxes instead of getting into that, because that's a whole nother can of worms that we're opening up when we start talking that way. But it's very clear to me that when the government doesn't want you to be right, they collude and they make this just a big mess so that everybody is guilty of making that mistake. So at any time they can just come in and reassess you and say, you know what, there's something you missed. It's like every other law on the street. As soon as you walk out the door, you're breaking the law somewhere, doing something, so they have the right to come into your life and intrude. And I really believe that that's why the tax code has become as messy as it is because they want that control and that power over top of you to at any time come in and say, you know what? And then when you simplify that, it takes that power away.
Right.
And I really believe that is where we've been going for the last 50 years with our government, is that they want that ultimate control and power over everything you do. And they want to be that nanny state and to have a flat tax and a really high minimum earnings takes that power away from them. It empowers us. And I don't think that they want that in this country for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But I really see that as the agenda behind that. But it's nice to actually see an accountant out there who understands this and is pushing back against that, saying, there's a better way and an easier system that we can do.
Yeah. I talk about that a bit in the book, how the system of, over 100 tax credits and deductions, it allows, I love the phrase, the nanny state, because it allows the government feels politicians and academics who help the politicians come up with these policies, they feel a need to really micromanage the lives of the masses of citizens. They feel that we're almost like children, and they're the parents, and they're responsible for us. So they don't necessarily trust us to put our children in fitness programs to get them exercising. So we need to make a tax credit so you'll be more likely to put your children in soccer. It's like, we know our children need to be physically active. We don't need a tax credit for that, right? And they do this for every life event. I mean, child care deduction, RRSP, we don't trust that you're going to save money for retirement. So we're going to build this crazy complicated retirement system with RRSPs and TFSAs to encourage you to save for retirement. Meanwhile, the government doesn't save money. They have $1 trillion debt that keeps growing every day. So it's kind of like hypocritical, but they have to micromanage our lives through the T1 individual tax filing system, which drives everyone crazy. Sure. Meanwhile, who's micromanaging the government, right? Who manages the government? That's
exactly
the big problem.
But I and again, it's that push, right? As long as you're under the microscope, they're not.
Right.
So they can do what they want, do as I say, not as I do. And it's funny that you say that, because I've often said the same thing with CPP and EI.
Yeah.
Is you don't trust us enough to
exactly
pay for that. So you're going to steal my income.
They force it.
And then at the point when I do need you the most, I've lost my job, whether I got fired or I quit, it has no bearing on the fact that I'm now unemployed.
Right.
And I've given you my money and trust to look after me when that happens. And yet now I have to jump through these hoops. And how many people end up on EI or don't get EI when they lose their job, or they, the boss fires them because they wouldn't, work in an unsafe area, or whatever reason it is. Yeah. And the same with CPP. How many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year do people contribute to, or in a lifetime? How much money would you put in? And now if you had that in just even like a little hedge fund on the own of your own at 5% over 50 years, right, you're 10 times ahead of where the government is. So are they really looking after you with these programs? Right. I'm advocating myself to take EI and CPP back in the province of Ontario and make it just an agreement with your employer. Right. And set up 2 mutual funds. When you go get your SIN card, there's 2 mutual funds that are opened. Yeah. Bank of your choice, invest that money in there. And then at the point when you do lose your job, or even say you want to buy a house, that's another huge issue with people coming up today is property values have gone to the point where mortgages are going to become generational. And you don't have anything to get to that point where you've got that $50,000 to put the down payment on the $500,000 home. Right. But if you had an EI and a CPP and a mutual fund off to the side, and after 5 or 6 years you've got $80,000 or $90,000 saved up in this fund for yourself, you could get that mortgage because you have equity in your own name. Right. These are interesting avenues that I would see, and I think if you take CPP and EI off of your tax form and your contributions, it's another way to simplify that. So I really believe that you and I are completely on the same page with how to get to a better place in this. Yeah. But I think what people need to understand is that these are unnecessary complications in the program.
For sure.
And as you say, when you raise that, you could raise the minimum to almost $50,000 federally. Yeah. And it would still be revenue neutral. Yeah. Right. Because you're taking away all the fluff.
All the deductions and credits. Yeah. So, and what you mentioned about CPP and EI, both CPP and EI, they have pros and cons, but what's lost in the conversation, and this relates to the second category. So I explained how we could fix the tax system for employees. And for self-employed people, there's 4 chapters in my book dealing with self-employment and small business owners. And the burdens that they have to go through, it's absolutely crazy. And I'm a small business owner myself. I'm running my own accounting practice and dealing with HST and payroll taxes, CPP and EI. Forget about the employee that has it deducted from their check. It's the obligation on the employer. Even if you just hire one employee, even if it's yourself, that's what's so ridiculous. Even if you have your own small business corporation, you're an incorporated business owner, and you want to pay yourself a salary, you have to open a payroll account with CRA, deduct CPP and income tax from your own salary, file a T4 slip for yourself. It's totally nuts.
And match it as the business owner.
And match it as the employer. Self-employed people pay double CPP. Now, they're exempt from EI, but it doesn't quite even out. But the point is that employers go through a tremendous amount of complicated bureaucracy. It's very costly because the vast majority of small business owners have to hire accountants and hire bookkeepers and hire people to help them. Payroll, to calculate payroll for your employees, it's so much more complicated than people think to calculate the right CPP, EI, and income tax deductions, file the T4s on time. They have to pay the CRA every month or every quarter. If you're a few days late, 10% penalty of the amount owing of the. I mean, it's not a fun endeavor for people. It does discourage people from hiring employees. They want to try and hire contractors instead of employees, and then the CRA will audit and say, no, those are really employees, they weren't contractors. So it's just such a mess, and there's no compensation. Like, employers are not compensated by the government for being tax collectors. If you think about how tax is collected, all income tax and sales tax in this country is collected by employers and small business owners, and they're not compensated for this work. So, and there's a lot of work that they're doing, filing HST returns, collecting HST, remitting the HST to the government. They have to pay quarterly or monthly, or, I mean, there's no compassion in the system. It's not easy. And I talk about in the book, in the Grumpy Accountant, how we can simplify this system as well for people who are self-employed and small business owners. So there's some ideas there as well. And
we don't want to spoil the book. We don't want to spoil the book because we want everybody to be intrigued enough to go and read your book, because I think it's an awesome thing that you're doing and putting it out there. But there are ways to do this as people, to push back to the government, and engage your MPPs and your MPs and make sure that we reform that. It's funny that you say that and we're basically, the businesses are tax slaves of the government to collect for them because they're not being paid to do that. Right. And it brings me to Jean-Serge Brisson.
I love that guy. He's a Canadian hero. I read his book, and I never heard of him until it was actually the Ontario Libertarian Party sent out an email about his book. And that's when I first heard of him. And I emailed him right away. I said, I want a copy of your book. I bought it and I read it in one day, and I couldn't put it down. And my wife's like, what are you reading? And I was blown away. He is a hero.
He is. And for those of you out here who don't know who Jean-Serge Brisson is, he basically stopped filing taxes, and he stopped collecting them from his customers at the same time.
This was when GST first came into being in 1991. Yes. And then PST as well in the early 90s. Yeah.
That's right. 95, I think, was the last time he filed, because he said, I'm not your slave. You don't compensate me for collecting taxes on your behalf. I refuse to do work for free for you. Yeah. And that just finally now got settled in court last year. He won the case. He didn't win it on its merits, though. They refused to disclose how they knew that his SIN number was his, because he said there's over 8 million SIN numbers in Canada that are attached to people that don't exist or are false. Oh, wow. So show me where in the system where this 9-digit number that you think is me is me. And they refused to open up their books to disclose how they knew all this information.
Wow.
And the judge threw it out, which is unfortunate. And I think they did that on purpose because they didn't want him to win on its merits, because at the end of the day, if he's a tax slave, everybody's a tax slave, and that would just totally throw the system on its ear. But the fact that he stood up for it and the fact that he won that case is huge for people. And yes, he is also one of my idols and heroes too. It's funny to run into people, and the libertarian movement has actually introduced me to some awesome people like yourself who are pushing back against the system. And we need more people like that to do that kind of stuff. Where can we get your book? Where is this available?
Yeah, the paperback is on Amazon.ca. The ebook is available everywhere, wherever you read an ebook, and the audiobook is coming out in a couple weeks. So we recorded the audiobook, and it'll be out in a couple weeks. But you can buy the paperback on Amazon.ca.
I absolutely love that. Neal, I wanted to thank you very much for coming on the show today and explaining a little bit about our complicated system and telling everybody why you are a grumpy accountant. I think that's the best name ever. I'm looking forward to the next one. I'm going to be reading this one shortly because I really want to get into chapter 8 and 9. Yeah. Because I want to make sure that I have my due diligence for my interest in penalties that I can try to recover. Hopefully I get something back because
Yeah.
It's been an F5 tornado in my life. It's actually what brought me into libertarianism, to be honest,
Yeah.
was when I got hit that hard for no
Yeah.
reason at all. I'm like, why?
Yeah.
What did I do wrong as a
Yeah.
person? And it was their reassessment. It's not that I filed late, even. It was they reassessed and they said,
Right.
you know what, you've made mistakes and we're going to
Right.
penalize you for that. So
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about politics. I didn't know what a libertarian was. I didn't know what a liberal, conservative, I didn't know anything. I wasn't involved. And then as I started filing tax returns and seeing how this all works, I became like a crazy libertarian. And although I don't like labels, but I mean, definitely the idea of individual liberty and government overreach and these ideas, I think, are so important. And thank you for all the work you're doing to support this movement as well.
I appreciate that. I want it to be ground up, and I'm not educated in any special manner. I'm just a bricklayer. I'm just a guy off the street who sees these problems. But
Yeah.
If we're not the ones pushing back, nobody's pushing back.
Right.
So it's if we don't stand up, and this is to each person out there who watches this or listens, if you're not standing up for your own rights, you don't have any. They're privileges. A right is only something that you're willing to defend yourself with your own life. The minute someone comes in and takes that from you, you realize really quickly that it is only a privilege if you're not willing to stand up for it and defend yourself for it. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, Neal, and I look forward to the next books. And I love the conversation that we have today. I'd love to get you on again another time, and we can talk some more. And just at the end of the day, I want to add one more thing. I think everybody who identifies now as a libertarian always was one. They just didn't realize that label was out there and it existed.
Yeah.
That was how I came to libertarianism, was like, when that tax stuff was going, I was watching Ron Paul in the United States running. And my favorite story about that is the silver dime, when they were talking, Newt Gingrich is going to bring gas down to $2.50 a gallon in the United States. And the other guy says, well, $3 is probably where we're going to get to. And Ron Paul picks up a silver dime, says, I pay 10 cents a gallon for gas, because the amount of silver in this dime is worth 1 gallon of gas. And he says, it's not the price of gas that's flawed, it's your currency.
Yeah.
And he put the dime down on the table, and my mind was exploded. And immediately I became a libertarian in my mind. So, all right, Neal, thank you again for coming on the show. And for all those people out there, go buy the book, have a read, empower yourself to understand your tax system and push back, because we can do better than this. And other countries, modern world countries, are doing this.
Yeah.
And Neal wants to look for another job, so he's not grumpy anymore. So help him out.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
You have a wonderful day, and thanks for coming on the show, Neal.
Thank you. You too. Thanks.
Bye now.
Look behind me.